So welcome to everybody. You're in the right place if you've come for the ProSilva webinar about forestry establishment design for continuous cover forestry. And thanks to the Department of Agriculture for supporting this. So what it's going to look like tonight, we'll have an introduction from me, then we'll have Manus Crowley setting the scene, a panel discussion with Manus, Paddy Purser and Pádraig Ó Tuama. There'll be a chance for you all to ask questions. And if you have any questions during the conversation, please put those into the chat window. So tonight we're going to be hearing about the design principles of establishing a CCF forest, focusing on robust species mixtures and species compatibility for forest resilience. Our speakers will go into depth on what's involved in choosing this path and the implication for new forest owners. So just introduce the people that are here tonight presenting. So I'm Anna Brown. I'm a forest owner in Kildare. I planted in 1995 a mix of oak and spruce, about half and half. I'm currently a flower farmer and sustainable educator, but I formerly worked as a techie, and so I still have a few technical skills, which hopefully won't be called into too much use tonight. Our panel starts with Manus Crowley. He's the chair of ProSilva Ireland. He's a forester and ecologist based in Southeast Ireland, practitioner of continuous cover forestry according to ProSilva Closer to Nature principles, and as MD and forestry consultant with N4 Limited. He's over 10 years experience working in the forestry sector in Ireland. Next up is Paddy Purser. He used to chair ProSilva Ireland, and he's currently on the committee still. He's a forest manager and consultant with Purser Tarleton Russell, providing services to Irish forest owners and the wider forestry and environment sector. He's at the forefront of development of CCF in Ireland. He's been a long-term advocate for the native woodland sector and has expertise in native woodland establishment and management. He's established over 17 new native woodlands and many other diverse forests in Ireland, majority in Wicklow, many other counties as well, and the lucky recipient of Paddy's Knowledge in My Forest. So I can speak to his great skills in this area. Finally, we have Pádraig Ó Tuama. He's currently working as a private consultant focusing on CCF and native woodland management. Previously, Pádraig worked in Cuillte Tuaireanta in Ireland for 30 years, covering many roles, including team leader, forest productivity, and district manager for the southwestern peninsulas. Pádraig had task leadership for research and promoting CCF in Cuillte for 15 years before leaving. He's been a member of ProSilva since 2003, was chairperson from 2010 to 15, and is secretary of the board of ProSilva Europe since 2015. He's on the board of the newly established Atlantic AFI. So we're in great hands tonight. Lots of very good knowledge here at the webinar. So looking forward to hearing what they have to say about this topic. So I'm going to hand over to Manus now. He'll be setting the scene for us.
Thanks, Anna. So I have to correct you there. I'm nearly 20 years in forestry now, unfortunately. So I have to.
You better update the web there, Manus.
The website. Yeah. So yeah.
I'll fix that.
So yeah, no, thanks a million. So I'd just like to welcome everyone here on behalf of ProSilva Ireland to the second in this year's webinar series. And these webinars are possible through the support of the DAFM Forestry Support Fund. So thanks to DAFM for providing us with that. So welcome to all our members, and some of you might be new to ProSilva Ireland, so you're also very welcome. Just explain who we are. ProSilva Ireland is a not-for-profit voluntary organisation. We were founded in the year 2000, and we're part of a wider international network of ProSilva organisations across 27 member countries. So we're an all-Ireland organisation, and we promote continuous cover forestry, or CCF, and close to nature management systems. So CCF aims to integrate multiple forest functions while maintaining a permanent forest structure. And within ProSilva, we see forest management and CCF management under a number of continuous cover or ProSilva principles. I'll just list these for you now. So they are protection of soils and water, conservation of ecosystems and enhancement of natural habitats, production of quality timber, and amenity and recreation. And along with this, you'd have promotion of diversity and resilience within forests and storing and sequestration of carbon. So we would view a forest providing all of these functions within the one forest. So these pro-silva principles support forests which are considered both ecologically and economically sustainable. So it's just a little bit of background to who we are. So tonight's discussion is around forest establishment design for continuous cover forestry. I just want to give you a little bit of context of what that's about. So for a long time, and in the past, afforestation in Ireland was for the most part consisted of planting of single species plantations, or at least individual blocks or plots of single species within plantations. So if you imagine, I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of forests in Ireland. You could have a Sitka spruce forest with a couple of lines of broadleaves around the perimeter. You might have an adjacent plot that could be a different species, Douglas fir, for example, an adjacent plot then that could be ash. So we had a quite compartmentalized way of planting. There was some mixing going on, particularly when we were planting hardwoods. We might have alternating rows of oak with Scots pine or Japanese larch. So there was some element of mixtures, but primarily when we're looking at timber production, especially of conifers, it was generally considered easier to establish single species stands and also long term to manage them as single species stands. Just because of the different growth rates, and all the trees grow at the same pace, they all grow the same way. So when that's your primary goal, timber production on a short rotation, it's I suppose it's a fairly straightforward way. So the legacy of this type of forest establishment has meant that us as CCF foresters and practitioners have been largely working in these monoculture type forests. So with CCF, a strong focus has always been the introduction, enhancement, and maintenance of tree species diversity within an existing forest. And this is achieved usually through underplanting, retention of diversity, and promotion of natural regeneration. So you might ask, that why is diversity important? So why do we care about having a mixed forest? So one of the primary benefits of tree species diversity for a forest is greater forest resilience. This is a word we use a lot at the moment, particularly as we see significant changes within our climate happening. Monocultural plantations are generally more vulnerable to diseases. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the recent problem we had with ash dieback in Ireland. Over a short period of nearly 15 years, we've seen massive decimation of ash stands, both wild ash and within our forests. There's many other diseases in Ireland in trees, phytophthora larch, sudden oak death, insects like new and lately's processionary moth in oak. Across Europe, they've similar situations with ash dieback, and also increasingly spruce monocultures being attacked by spruce bark beetle. This is kind of like a twofold issue, because a lot of these spruce forests in Europe are suffering from drought-induced stress as a result of climate change. So a lot of these issues are starting to occur. So research, and there's not a massive amount of research around this, but there's more building, but it's shown that the rate of transmission of disease and pests tends to be slower within a mixed stand. And that, if you think about it, it's kind of because there's lower host density. So you've less ash trees concentrated in the forest, and they're kind of spread out across the forest. But this also has a knock-on effect. So if the ash is infected within a forest, within a mixed stand, it represents a lower overall percentage of the stand. So even if the ash does all die, it doesn't result in the complete destruction of the forest or the loss of the forest ecosystem and subsequently the timber resource. With increased climate change, we're seeing more problems with wind and extreme weather events. So mixed stands have been shown to have increased stability because of their irregular structures towards wind throw and extreme weather events. Also, mixed forests have higher associated biodiversity. Mixed stands have greater benefits for biodiversity. If you imagine each species in a forest can have an associated bird, mammal, insect, plant assemblage that's associated with that tree. So by having a forest with multiple trees in it, you're obviously creating more habitat niches for lots of these species. Different trees mixed together tend to have different light regimes. Larch is a very interesting conifer because it actually sheds its leaves. So you have, huge variation in the light within the forests, different nutrient cycling happening in mixed forests, and it's allowing different development of ground flora and herb layers throughout. But also, and what might be more interesting to timber foresters, is having a mixed stand allows us to have a wider range of species growing within the forests. And some of these species might be, reaching sawlog at slightly different stages, different log sizes, different types of timber, different timber qualities. So it means that a mixed species stand could be more adaptable to change in timber market conditions and can be more productive over a longer time frame. So look, all of that, it's leading to we in ProSilva are absolutely delighted that we now have this new afforestation option being offered to Irish farmers and landowners. It's called FT10, so it's for continuous cover forestry. And just to finish my little introduction, we worked very closely, the ProSilva practitioners and foresters within ProSilva worked very closely with the Forest Service during the development phase of this option, and we were instrumental in the design of the specific scenarios that are available. So I can probably say it wouldn't have happened without the help of ProSilva. So just to acknowledge that. So that's my little piece there, Anna.
Great, thanks, Manus. So we're going to spotlight also our other two panelists and start the panel discussion. So yeah, so very interesting. And I suppose when we think of continuous cover, we often think of the end rather than, or the middle rather than the beginning. So maybe just could we talk a bit, maybe Pádraig talk a bit about how this new category CCF10 will work under in people who are trying to start a new forest.
Suppose one can consider it in the basis if the person wants to establish, have a forest along the lines and principles that Man's just outlined. And this is how it's great that Forest Service have offered this new forest type that they can that they could do that. But the GPC4 before and that you could have mixtures, but this is more specifically for a range of species on site that established at this very initial stage. Generally, we do our transformation in Ireland because all our woodlands are even age, and we start at a later stage and we do transformation and change mixed species and introduce species later in that transformation as much you can. But now we can, and from the very beginning, have that mixture of species, one of those important principles of continuous cover forestry from the beginning. So with the scheme, it's best that like any management, when you're planning your woodland, that you have to consider that when continuous cover forestry, this is going to be a managed woodland for throughout the cycle. So it really, I suppose, has to have you have to be able to consider, is this going to be harvestable? Am I going to be able to harvest this site over time? And you'd like to have a kind of an area sufficient enough, because less have a small, we have people can manage the 1 and 2 and 3 hectare blocks. It is more difficult to produce machinery and that to decide. So you can select. And what I'm saying is that if you can have an area 6-7 hectares, that is very viable for machinery to come in to mark beginnings or to be able to harvest, then that makes it more viable option. If you want to do your 1 hectare site, well and good, and you can manage it the way that can be managed as best it could. You can also join native woodland scheme is also FT1, FT2, and or more than likely FT1 is also a species mixture, but mainly of native woodland species. So you can have if you're doing your in a forestation application, you could have so many hectares of native woodland, so many hectares of FT1, and so many hectares of FT10. So that gives you a kind of a good compact area, and and under the native woodland scheme, it's kind of a forestation scheme. It is envisaged that those areas should be managed under continuous cover forestry into the future as well. Or introducing a broader mixture of species, using spruce and that in the 2 scenarios given in the woodland in the afforestation book, kind of says, okay, the idea that you'd have Sitka spruce at the beginning, a Sitka spruce, Douglas fir, or what the mixtures are, Sitka spruce, other conifers and broadleaves. And the whole concept is that you have a staged kind of that the Sitka spruce would be a fast-growing species, and then the other two, which would be Douglas fir or other spruces, could be compatible, but you can grow those along. That you have the Sitka spruce, that Sitka spruce might reach its target diameters at around the 40, 45 years of age, and you'd have the other, the Douglas firs coming on, maybe in reaching their target diameters at 60, 70, 80 years of age, and then you'd have the oak, the other broadleaf mixtures later on, so that you'd have that continuity. While you have that 40 and 50 and 60 years of age, all the other species would be regenerating underneath again, giving you that continuity. So that's, in general, the idea is that an area size had a species that are compatible, and we can talk about that later. A species that's compatible, and a that are kind of consider shade tolerant and growth rate, and have an area that you think you can manage well into the future, and add if you're designing your forest native woodland scheme and your CCF schemes.
Great, great. Thank you, Padraig. Yes, and we're talking in lifetimes here, in terms of the
Yes.
scale of time, which is always interesting in the world of forestry.
No,
So
it's a permanent forest we're creating.
yes, right. There's never going to be any clear fell.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. I like that. So, Paddy, maybe talk a little bit about the principles that would apply to these kind of woodlands.
Yeah, so there's a number of kind of overall principles which apply. The first one is common to all forestry and all afforestation, which is matching species to site. So that's a fundamental principle the foresters learn in the first year when they study forestry, is that you should be matching species to site. And in the case of native woodland, this would obviously involve identifying the appropriate native woodland type for the site as well. But it also involves a more nuanced kind of approach to setting out a site and identifying kind of minor changes in the site type, particularly on larger sites, where you might have change in soil depth or drainage or exposure and so on. So I think in terms of that particular principle, the matching species to site, I think the important point is that we're doing that rather than trying to modify the site to suit a particular species. So in the past, there was a lot of site modification carried out in order to accommodate a certain species or production. And I think the principle here is that you would be more cognizant of the actual site conditions as they are. And because it is a permanent forest, and you adapt your species to the micro site conditions. So that's kind of the first principle. The second one, Manus and Padraig have covered pretty well, I think, at this stage. It's in terms of integration of mixed species. And I would say in particular that we would be using conifers and broadleaves on the commercial sites. Obviously, native woodlands are native woodlands. But we in introducing broadleaves into conifers or conifers into broadleaves, we got different crown development, different root architectures, different microbial associations, longevities, and so on that Padraig mentioned. And that's all important in terms of building resilience. But it's also in terms of building a more diverse forest for the market as well in the long term. So that's kind of mixing species. The third principle is, and again, it's been alluded to already, is that we've got trees growing at different rates. We're going to select species for the site which grow at different rates. And we've got to separate those. So that's a kind of a principle in the, particularly to the time of afforestation. If we were to just integrate everything in a very intimate way, we would very quickly lose all the slower growing species under the canopy of the faster growing species. And so we've got to do work on our design to allow that not to happen. And that normally means planting in groups. And there's very good guidance on this in the Woodlands of Ireland have guidance in terms of native woodland development on that. So that's kind of the separating the species with different growth rates. There's a fourth principle, which is we want to try and introduce from the outset species which are both light demanding and then other species which would be shade tolerant. And so this allows you to develop a species mix which has the potential to generate structural development in the long term. So by structural development, we mean a multi-canopied forest, trees which would be in the overstory, mid-story and understory. And if all your species are light demanding, that's not going to be possible without generating very large holes in the wood. So introducing those kind of range of light demanding species is important at the start. And then finally, of my kind of principles anyway, the final principle I would kind of refer to, and this is particularly for commercial forests, and Padraig referred to it as well in terms of trying to introduce idea that you would have short-term producing species, medium-term producing species, and longer-term producing species. So let's take, spruce. That was the example Padraig used. Spruce or birch maybe is shorter-term species. Western red cedar or Douglas fir is medium-term, and then your oak or your beech as your long-term species. So trying to introduce all of those elements of diversity, not just the species of diversity, but the diversity of maturity, diversity of light demanding as well, or light and shade tolerance. So those are for me, Anna, they're kind of the principles which we set out, and then obviously every site it has to be applied. They have to apply differently, and then the owner's objectives obviously come into play massively.
Very good. So I think Padraig and Manus, would you agree with those principles? Would you have anything to add to that, or no? Good.
I would, I suppose, maybe just refer to another the appropriate people can consider is the establishing robust species mixture, which is used by Gary Kerr and Jan Hoff and Victoria. I think first on the Forestry Commission, and where it's kind of just a very formulaic way of comparing growth rates and species compatibility for establishing woodlands. So it's another one. Maybe we might put up on the site afterwards a link to that.
Great. Okay, fantastic. Some more resources. Okay, so Manus, back to you now. Maybe talk about what the ongoing management of these mixtures would look like after establishment.
Yeah. So I'm just going to share these images that were prepared by one of our members, Sean Hoskins. I think they really, really well demonstrate everything that we're talking about here. Yeah. So what you can see here, this is Sean tells me anyway, 0.22 of a hectare. So just imagine a site, it's been planted about 4 years, and you can see there on the right hand side, Sean has a legend there explaining what they are. So it's just to show you, this is just a representative example. The groups could be different sizes, there could be different numbers in them, there could be different species. There could be a multiple different ways of doing it. But just in this particular case, this is obviously a fairly dry site. So there's Sitka spruce, Douglas fir, that could also have cedar, you've pedunculate oak, birch, and then ADB is kind of mixed broadly. So this is broadly a species mixture that you would use. So 60% spruce, 20% other conifers, 10% pedunculate oak, and then about 10% other broadleaf. So, we arrange them in squares. I know this might look quite regular. I think when we're trying to plant sites, you can't make things too crazy for the planters. So we tend to stick, it does look quite regular, but I think you'll find as it progresses through the cycle as such, you'll see it changing. So anyway, just to show you, there's a 0.22 hectare area and 2 groups of oak, 4.5 groups of Douglas, a couple of little groups of ADB, and a couple of groups of birch scattered around. So you can see it's fairly mixed already, but there's still a structure kind of holding it together. It's not that the trees are all just crazily intimately mixed together. Trees kind of grow better when they're kept together in groups because of kind of interspecific competition. As Paddy was saying earlier, you could have done this another way. We just mix it all up, but the different growth rates of the trees. You know, Douglas fir kind of area is a little bit slower than Sitka. On certain sites, it can be completely swamped out. Oak as well. If you had that scattered throughout the site individually, it'd just disappear out of stand. So I'm just going to cycle this on a little bit. So this is showing roughly 2 years after a first tinning intervention has been done. So you can see these lines here. That's where a full row of trees has been removed. That's a rack. There's another one there. So that's 1, 2, 3. That's a 1 in 8 rack removal. Again, this is just for an example. You could have 1 in 7, 1 in 6, 1 in 10. Ideally, as far apart as possible. So the racks are put in. Large wolf trees are removed. Biggest, baddest trees taken out. 1 or 2 competitors from each of the good quality trees of any species, and all species are removed. So we're not favouring one species over another. We're promoting diversity everywhere throughout the stand. You can start to see some irregularity occurring. Some of the trees are obviously growing faster than other ones. So you can see already that the quite regular nature of the stand is starting to get disrupted a little bit as you start tinning and removing trees here and there. By tinning, it also opens it up to allow you to come in and maybe do a little bit of tending work on some of the broadleaves there. So there's an example of an oak group that a rack went straight through the side of it there, but that does give you some access into that if you want to do some pruning as such on them. We're going to skip on a good bit now. So this is actually to around the year that Padraig was talking about, which is year 45. So it's quite different now at this stage. Obviously the trees are all a lot bigger. Some Sitka sawlog, or a good bit of the Sitka sawlog, has been harvested at this stage, because that's around the year that, or just after the year that Sitka becomes most profitable to harvest at a certain size. You know, some Sitka is still retained, though we don't remove all of it. Like it would be progressively taken out over time, but it's still there as a seed source. We're planting a Sitka in the site. We're starting to see some elements of natural regeneration occurring at this stage. So these little tiny trees, there's spruce starting to regenerate here, and here's some birch, some oak here. So there's a little bit of natural regeneration occurring. Much greater irregularity in height. So you can imagine, obviously this is only a 2D image, but structurally you're going to have lots of different layers developing in the forest because of the natural regeneration coming on. And lots of different sizes of crowns, lots of irregularity and DBH coming through it. And, you know, I just cycled straight back to the first one again. And there you can see the forest looking really regular, lots of Sitka spruce everywhere. You bring it back here, it's starting to, the Douglas fir is almost looking like it's more dominant at this stage. We just put these in here so you can see that's actually where the racks are. So those racks are permanent racks within the forest, and they stay there. We'd probably need to do a few more slides for you, but it'd be quite interesting to bring it up to year 80 and see what does it look like. And we probably start seeing that the oak is becoming more dominant then at that stage. So it's just showing there's a kind of a cycle of development as you move through a 45-year period. And depending on what mixture you use at the start, you could end up with lots more oak. You could have ratios with higher broadleaves used. You know, there's multiple different ways, but this is just one example and one way that we're currently doing. We're not saying it's the right way, but it's just the way that we're doing at the moment. But I think over time we learn more and probably tweak the ratios that we're using, and you know, every site is different. So there you go.
Great.
Good.
Picture worth 1,000 words there, I think.
Yeah, so thanks to Sean Hoskins for preparing that.
Very good.
You wouldn't want to know he was up at 2 o'clock in the morning drawing things. So.
Very good. So maybe talk a bit about the implications if you actually choose to go this way when you're doing some forestation or reforestation on your land. What are the implications as a landowner?
Dennis,
for you.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's kind of an idea that by planting an FT10 CCF woodland that there's an obligation then that the site should be managed, that it has to be managed under CCF. Of course, you know, the Forest Service is encouraging people to plant this FT with a view that they will manage it under CCF long term and create a permanent forest. But I don't think there's any legal mandatory law such that you have to do that. I think as well as that, you know, it's important that people are aware, because they're so resilient, it possibly should be something that people consider, even if they weren't going to manage it under CCF. Of course, there will be some implications in the timber production element, because normally we clear fell at about year 35, so you would have some longer term species left in the site that wouldn't really make sense to be clear felling them earlier. But look, we'd hope most people would plan to manage under CCF if they go into the FT10.
Okay. And so then the obvious question is, what happens if you go with FT10 and your broadleaves all get eaten by deer?
Well, thankfully, the Forest Service are allowing us to access the deer fencing scheme under this. This is a massive boon or achievement for this FT. Like, people mightn't realise the reason you see an awful lot of Sitka spruce being planted everywhere, particularly in Wicklow, is because there's so many deer everywhere. So in order to plant diverse species, you have to put up deer fences because the deer browsing is so bad. So with this FT10, we're allowed to use a deer fence, even though we've a very high percentage of Sitka spruce in the site. So look, the deer fence are protected there for you.
Deer don't like eating Sitka spruce then?
They will eat them, yeah, but there has to be a lot of deer around, and it has to be quite hungry to do that. But
fair enough.
Some areas they love them. So
okay, so it's great. Thanks, Manus. So, Paddy, this one's for you. How do you get the planters to carry out this work? How do you organize it? What preparation is necessary?
Yeah. Well, I already said the word groups. And that's I've been doing this for a while. And when we plant sites, we tend to use a planting gang who turn up in a minibus and or a large van, and they get out of the van and they see me, and they always say, "Paddy, groups." They're all Romanian generally, and I've become known as Paddy Groups with this particular planting contractor. So so using groups is as Manus described in the graphic. That's the kind of starting point, if you like, and it depends on the scale of the site, and I suppose the experience of the planting gang. The guys we use are kind of used to what we do now. But you know, if it's a new thing to you or to your planters, it's a good idea to set out the site and the location of the groups, and you can do that. I still do it on some sites. Set out the location of the groups with bamboos. So we'd use a color coding system. So we'd use a spray can, different color spray on bamboos for, you know, different code for different species, different color for different species, or for different size of groups. You know, again, larger sites, sometimes you might use slightly larger groups, and smaller sites, smaller groups. But you kind of set it out, so it's very easy for people to for the contractor to see. He sees an orange bamboo, that's a group of 20 birch, or a green bamboo, it's a group of 20 oak or something like that. Yeah, there's a bit of time, probably a little bit more time, and to set out the site in advance. And that's a real opportunity to micro kind of map the site as well, you know, to make sure that you've identified the wet areas where, you know, you might change the species, or the shallower soil where you might do something different, or so yeah, a little bit more time in advance. And then also then when you have the delivery of plants, they come to the forest gate or the farm gate, we spend a bit more time just there. Either the contractor does it or we can do it. Just mixing trees in bags as well, because some of the groups we would mix species within a group, you know, the compatible species within a group, and we'd mix them in a bag. So you might have a group of which is kind of jointly Scots pine and birch, for example, or you might have mixing hazel and oak together or something like that, and they'd be they'd cohabitate a group. So it's a little bit more there's a bit more kind of forester micromanagement on site, but this is a permanent forest, and for the sake of an extra few hours, it's absolutely 100% worth it and should be done.
Okay. Thanks, Paddy. And I suppose I was a bit stuck there on groups. Was it groups of people or groups of trees? But then you made it clear it was groups of trees. So, yes, very good. So I suppose if anybody's got any questions, please type them into the chat. We're happy to hear from you. But we finally have a question for Porrick again about would this be different approach in a reforestation site, or would you be using a similar approach?
You would be using more as a similar approach. So you would. Many times you get clients coming to us and they say they want to do CCF, and you know this coming very late in a rotation cycle, hasn't been tinned or it's cited very suitable. Because it hasn't been tinned and that, and you'd say, oh God, it's a high risk to initiate transformation now, and perhaps you can exercise to take your hair felt cut and perhaps initiate your CCF and exercise ECF from the new. So in reforestation, you will have what you may have though, and I've seen a site even yesterday, an older 45-year-old crop spruce and a lot of young spruce seedlings. There was an in sight, even there was young spruce seedlings in many gaps. You may have a lot of regeneration coming through in some of the older spruce, the older sites. So you might have, and I know a lot across in the Midlands and other areas, and especially more fertile, maybe old woodland sites, you get an awful lot of birch regeneration. So those elements can be incorporated into your future planning. But overall, it generally is the same principles apply. So it is.
Okay, very good. So I have a question here from Niall. What is the benefit of planting specifically for CCF as opposed to planting as a more commercial mix and remediating later? I assume short-term income will be higher on the remediation option. Who'd like to take that one?
What do you mean by radiation
I
option?
don't understand the question.
So, okay, maybe I'll put it into the main chat. What is the benefit of planting specifically for CCF as opposed to planting as a more commercial mix? I mean, to me, CCF is commercial, but maybe the speaker is the questioners thinks differently. And remediating, so they're thinking to plant a commercial mix and remediate later to get to a CCF, I suppose, forestry. And he's saying, I assume short-term income would be higher on the remediation option. Now, if you want to put your mic on, maybe ask the question directly. If I'm making a dog's dinner out of it.
Yeah,
I-
sure. No, I think you've got it there. Like, I guess some of the other planting options under the forestry scheme, non-CCF, the impression would be there's probably more spruce in the mix. The income over the first 20, 30 years, it'd probably be higher than in CCF. So I guess what is the benefit to going with this specific CCF mix from day one, as opposed to, planting the more common garden mix and trying to convert to CCF further down the line?
I can take that if you wish.
Thanks,
I
Park.
think I mean the real principle as outlined at the beginning is that you do have that initial mix, because we're into these more or less monoculture species and we're trying to transform. So you're building in that forest resilience from a very early stage. I think that is the main element in that. I think when you're doing innings anyway, you were kind of focusing on kind of in the initial tinnings. I often think that, CCF tinnings are often more commercially viable. I think that's on the paper that me and myself did in the short term element. That CCF tinnings are often that more commercially beneficial to the owner, in the sense that you're taking a bigger tree and your harvest than the low tinning. The unit cost for harvesting should be that lower because you're taking a bigger tree. So there's the kind of stump a better standing or stumpage value from your thinnings. And if you're taking out some broadleafs in that mixture, or the other species, is mainly pulpwood in the first and second thinnings anyway. The broadleaves have a value in their from a firewood value as well. So I mean, I know from an experience, we're all selling firewood presently. If you're selling firewood, you get 3 or 4 times more for your firewood value on the roadside than you will when you down to do the main mills. So there is a higher value in your pulpwood too. So there is value in doing your thinnings, and you have the benefit of a resilient forest, because if you have that disease coming in earlier, you have an existing forest.
Great. Now, does that answer your question fairly comprehensively there?
Yeah, I think there's
Great.
definitely benefits to it. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So we got one from Kevin Keary. What's the minimum viable group size and how is it determined? So it's groups of trees, I guess.
I don't think there is a minimal viable group size. We, even amongst us, I think we like to do things differently. I like groups 25. Some people like groups of 12. I think if you have a small group of, oak, your management around to look after them is going to be higher, because you'll have to be doing more heavier tinning to keep them in the mix. But I don't know if there's any hard and fast rules around group sizes. We've just sort of landed on certain sizes. Sometimes it's whatever the lads like, dividing bags of 100 into the remaining planters. They might say 30, 25, 50. But as Paddy said earlier, if you have a very small site, you don't want to be putting in huge groups, because then, if you have a group of 100 trees and you've only a hectare in a field, the impact of each group then becomes quite large. So you would modify your size to suit the size of the fields.
So the group size might map onto the land that you're, like the bigger groups in a bigger field and smaller groups in a smaller area.
Yeah, yeah. But you might make that decision on the day that you're planting. I think it's more the ratios of the species are more important than the group sizes. Do you want to add anything to that, Paddy?
Yeah, I might just add my thinking in both the layout of the groups and the size of the groups is that when it comes to first thinning, assuming that we would be thinning with a machine and with a rack layout, somewhat like what Manus presented on the graphic, say 1 and 8, 1 and 9, that kind of rack spacing, that the rack would be forced to go through a range of different groups. So in other words, that the group should be a minimum of 8 rows, 8 or 9 rows wide, and whatever depth it is. And the idea is that, from the very start, we manage all species that are there. That some will require different intensity of thinning, but we're able to manage, and particularly the edges of the group. So let's say we have groups of oak next to spruce, that we can manage the edge of the group to keep the oak released, that the spruce isn't starting to crowd in over the edge of the oak. Just as an example. So that would kind of push my minimum group size to about 24. Probably I'm using 30 commonly in a group size. But again, you do adapt them not just to the size of the site, but also you've already got a field layout within the on the land, and you're kind of adapting it to the field layout as well. And sometimes we use the corners of fields to put some groups, particularly more kind of to kind of, I suppose, to enhance the biodiversity value of the hedgerows and things like that. We would use we bulk up the corners of fields with native species, for example. So yeah, there's different thinking, and it's evolving. Even for myself, it's still evolving, but I like the idea that when I come to thin it, I'm forced to manage everything, and that I'm not just following around the spruce around the site at first thinning and ignoring the rest of the species, because it's important that everything gets managed from an early stage.
Right, great, Paddy. Lots of questions coming in here. I'll try and get through them. So this is another question for Paddy. Paddy Groups, he's been very on point here. Within groups, are you adopting different spacings appropriate to the species adopted, or is there a uniform spacing across the entire forestation project regardless of species?
No, we're being fairly consistent with the 2 meter spacing throughout,
Right.
and that's kind of tying in with the expectation of the grant and the afforestation scheme is that everything would be at 2,500 trees per hectare. We were doing it slightly differently previously, where we were mixing conifers and broadleaves, and we were putting broadleaves at a tighter spacing and conifers at the 2 meter spacing. But at the moment, we're doing everything at 2 meter spacing.
Okay, thanks, Paddy. So Jeremy would like to know about the cultivation methods used for FT1 sites, especially in the wetter parts of a given project. So that's the native woodlands, is the FT1.
Yeah.
I think in the native woodland, basically, it is you are doing inverted mounding primarily. So you are. The spacing is the same. No.
Okay, very good.
So,
Um,
so
If it's FT1, you're not allowed drainage in native woodland afforestation anyway, or intensification of drainage. So your options are probably on drier sites to use invert mounding, and on wetter sites to use scrap mounding.
yeah.
So the difference is with invert mounding, if you turn a sod and you put it back in the hole upside down, and scrap mounding, you turn the sod and you leave it beside the hole, slightly elevated. That's those are the options. Ripping is obviously an option as well on dry sites, but there aren't that many of them.
Right, fair enough.
Sorry, Anna, you might
Yeah.
have some localized wet areas in a site, and if they're not very big, you could just opt to pit plant those areas as well, rather than doing any cultivation on them. But that would be, you wouldn't want to have a huge area of that, because it'd become unwieldy for the planters to pit plant an entire huge area.
Okay,
To adapt your species to the wetter areas.
very good. So Darren Little was wondering, are there site type requirements specified by the Forest Service in order to qualify for grant aid under this FT10? There's actually an answer here from Kevin Carey. He says, and he's for the Forest Service, I believe. So I guess that's the right answer. So we can maybe move on from that one if you're happy enough. Or did you want to add anything to Kevin? Kevin says, depending on site characteristics, match species to site. Refer to the Forestry Standards Manual. It's on the DFM website. There's a table with all the species and site attributes.
Yeah.
Okay. So then there's one from Carl. Who is this webinar mainly aimed at? As in, who decides the design of an afforestation project, the forester or the landowner? Is there a risk of planting incorrectly that could invalidate the grant and the premiums?
I can answer that if you want to. It's any planting project is a collaboration between the landowner and the forester who providing technical advice. So it's the landowner's in charge. So it's what the landowner wants, subject to technical constraints for the site. So it's all very well presenting a site, saying they want an oak forest, but if the site's not suited to oak, that advice has to be given. And so it's a collaboration. Any afforestation project is always a collaboration between the owner who's driving and the co-driver who's the forester offering guidance.
Okay, very good. Now, just to note that this has been recorded, so we will be putting this recording on YouTube. So people wanted to see the diagrams, they'll be able to see them there in the future. I don't know if you plan to make those diagrams available in a book in the future as well. So maybe Manus, could you speak to that? People are interested to know if the diagrams will be available later.
They will be, yeah.
Yeah, grand. Okay. So there's Chris Barnett wants to know the panel's view on 55 to 60% Sitka spruce from a plant disease perspective. The crop is 60% Sitka spruce for the first 35 years. The risk remains high.
But is it 60% over 35 years? So we're going to be thinning the forest. and I think we'd be selectively thinning out spruce from the stand. I mean, I do understand the question, but I mean, we're currently planting the sites that are 80 or 90% Sitka spruce. So, you know, the commerciality of spruce is still so strong. We need to create some element of structure to work around. And it, you know, if you start, I suppose, what's the alternative? Do we use a different conifer? Do we use hardwoods? You know, the species mixtures can be modified to suit your needs. We were talking today, Padraig, about, you know, maybe using other diverse conifers in the mix as the matrix species, if you want to look at that. But I still think it's important to have one species that's quite high in the mix. Otherwise, it becomes unwieldy from a management point of view. I mean, we do the same in our native woodlands. We plant 40–50% oak, you know. So it's just a product of the type of designs that we're using at the moment.
Okay,
I
thanks,
think
Matt.
also like there is a great reducing. I mean, the proportions are reducing of spruce at 35–40 years. Is probably down to maybe 25% at 40 years, not less. You know, so it is a reducing thing. The main focus of things will be on the spruce, but not the others as well.
Okay, so I'm just seeing a lot of questions are being answered by people, which is fantastic. In the chat window, and we're kind of up to the time window here. Do you guys want to carry on chatting? I can send some more questions your way, but they're getting kind of specific at this point. Are you happy to call it an evening at this point?
I'm happy to continue for
Okay.
People are.
So there's one here. We were in the final stage of purchasing a 27-hectare site as 25 acres planted by Greenbelt in 2010. We want to implement CCF. When would we be able to? Do we have to stay with Greenbelt, or would we be better off leaving their program? Anybody want to take that one?
Well, it's not really a CCF question. It's you're free to choose whatever forester you want. I don't think you have to stick with the company who planted. So regardless of who the company were, it's up to you. It's again, the forest owner is the driver and is in charge. So the forest owner just select who they want to use.
Grant, thanks, Paddy.
And
So that's
then given your crop is only 14 years of age, it really is an opportune time to start planning your continuous cover forestry. The early stage, the better.
very good. Great, Park. Thank you. So here's one about deer fencing. In your opinion, would temporary deer fencing work using left ash trees as fence posts for protecting broadleaf trees from deer? I read somewhere that deer do not like to go into small spaces.
It might, but I think the scale of the costs of protecting each individual little small broadleaf group, and it's not just the broadleaves that will be attacked. So 55% of your stand is Sitka, but the other 45% is stuff that's palatable to the deer. So are you going to go around with a little deer ash fence around all of them? Like, the funding is there. I'm not sure if this person's referring to FT10 now in particular, a new A4 site, but the funding for the deer fencing is there, so I would avail of it. I mean, it's usually adequate to cover the cost of putting up a deer fence, depending on the size of the site. Kind of goes back to what Padraig was saying earlier about trying to plant little small 1 or 2 hectare sites. If you have a big deer problem, that could be challenging to get a deer fence around it. But in general, on a 5 hectare, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hectare site, the deer fencing allowance is enough to cover the deer fencing on it.
Okay. Very good. So then the next one for Brian Gleason. What are the time intervals for interventions in a CCF managed forest? For smaller forests, interventions will be more costly and may even be uneconomic if the interventions are more frequent. You kind of alluded to this a bit, Paddy, I think, at the start.
Or maybe I did. I think.
Okay, correct. Thanks. Sorry.
I mean, generally, depending on the growth rates of the forest and the you have you determine a thinning cycle, and It's kind of a guiding principle that you're removing 20% of the basal area. It's just a simple guiding principle, and that if you can do that, and good. And our general cycle is 4, 5, or 6 years, maybe further in the broadleaf woodland. And as you go out in the cycle, then it probably gets longer in that cycle, a more economical revenue from those later thinnings. From a smaller forest, a small forest has its issue regardless of size, regardless of its management. If you're doing anything, and and maybe you might push the thinning cycle out a year or two to get to garner, maybe even go for your 25 or 30% basal area to maybe have an economic thing, but it still has the same issues with the machinery type or the kind of intervention that you're going to do.
Okay. Thanks, Pádraig. So Carl Courtney's wondering, I think this is you were talking about the design principles, Paddy. Are there other places that use CCF as a management system? Are there other ways to look at the design outside of Ireland?
Yeah, well, I suppose this is developing in the UK at the same time. And there is the very good, there's a couple of publications in the UK. Pádraig referred to one there earlier. The Gary Kerr, which one was it, Pádraig? You were
Establishing Robust Species Mixtures by Gary Kerr, Forestry Commission.
Gary Kerr, yeah. And then there's a new kind of comprehensive and expensive book by Arnie Pommering on CCF management and best practice kind of guidelines, or not guidelines, but it's based on kind of UK silviculture as well, and there's a whole chapter on that on afforestation and design as well. So we can put up the references, those kind of references on the ProSilva website.
Okay, very good. One final question here. If the premium, sorry, now it just scooted up there. Okay, if the premium was the same as FT1, I suppose for FT10, there would be lots of FT10 planted. Was this discussed with the department? I see you nodding there, Manus. No?
No.
No.
No influence on that. I don't think the premium is that different, really. Is it 950 or something for FT10? I think it's 1100. It's not a massive difference between them, really. Like for standard spruce, it's 750. So they are making a considerable higher premium for the FT10. It's nearly €200 more per hectare.
Okay. So that's it for the questions, I think. Thanks, gentlemen. That was very interesting, very informative. I'm just going to bring up, be unspotlight you guys and bring up the kind of the final few slides to show. But thanks to people for showing up tonight and for engaging so vigorously with all the questions. So some things coming up for ProSilva. Calendar of events is a spring field day next month, 27th of April in County Down. A joint event with the Royal Forestry Society, the Northern Ireland Division. So it's Seaford Estate, which is a winner of the RDS 2022 Production Forestry Award. And I think field days are always great fun and good chance to discuss things and ask more questions. There's a joint field day with the ITGA, Friday 24th of May, and that's in County Wicklow, Knockrath Private Forest. There's an autumn field day, an AGM for ProSilva in County Galway in October. That's quite a ways away. And there's also a company called Select for running some CCF management courses, and that's on the ProSilva website. So next steps. I don't know, Manus, do you want to talk a little bit about if you're not a forester and you're not a landowner, what can you do to help ProSilva? And I suppose the obvious one is to join. And you talked a bit about that at the start, I think. You can follow us on Facebook. We'll have this webinar on YouTube at some point in the future. And if you're registered, you'll get an email to that effect. Have we got an Instagram? Someone says that. Someone mentioned we
Twitter, I think.
Twitter. Okay, very good. So anyhow,
and Instagram.
Yes,
Sorry,
so great. So
we have a new Instagram account.
Yes, that was spotted during the week by somebody. So very good. So thanks to all for showing up to this. And yeah, that's it for this evening, I think. Guys, really good, great questions, great knowledge here. So thanks to everybody for showing up.
Thank you.
Thanks, man. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. And sure, we'll have another one soon, hopefully. And I'm not sure what the next one planned is, Anna, but thanks a million for joining us.